M406. This lecture is going to be about regulatory enforcement, and it's going to go into the reading by Martin Nye from the Journal of Policy Sciences. So in the past, students get really confused by what is regulatory enforcement. So let's be clear about a few of the background things about how our government works. So Congress makes laws, and the state legislature makes laws, or the city council might make laws. And so they have a lot of things happening, particularly at higher levels, at the state and federal levels. So laws tend to be a little bit more vague. They may not specify everything that needs to be done. And typically what a law will say is, we want this government agency to take these actions, and this government agency is going to have to create those regulations, which are laws, in order to carry out the wishes of Congress. As an example, the Clean Air Act instructs the EPA that they are supposed to regulate air pollution. It doesn't say that the EPA should limit the amount of lead that's in gasoline, or that the EPA should require certain cities to implement techniques to decrease emissions, or what the scrubbers should be like at some of the power plants. It doesn't say anything about like which chemicals are allowed. The Congress just sets these really broad guidelines for what the EPA should regulate. Now, the EPA's job is to carry out that law by issuing regulations. It's the same thing with the Endangered Species Act. The ESA doesn't say anything about bald eagles or wolves or fish or plants. It just says that if a species is found to be endangered based on these criteria, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or if it's a marine mammal, the National Marine Fisheries Service, we need to follow these steps. And there's hundreds of species on the endangered species list, and each of them have different rules and regulations. Laws also create certain kinds of rights and responsibilities, laws, regulations, and government actions that are challengeable in court. So if you think the EPA should be regulating a certain pollutant, or maybe shouldn't be regulating a pollutant, or that maybe they're doing it incorrectly, you can go and file a lawsuit against the EPA. Or you can go to a federal district court and say the EPA is doing this and it violates the Clean Air Act, or it violates the Clean Water Act. You can also sue the Department of Fish and Wildlife if you think something is violating the Endangered Species Act. For instance, if you want to list an endangered species, you would submit a petition to Fish and Wildlife saying, we think this species should be listed as endangered. It's then up to the Department of Fish and Wildlife to either agree and say, yes, we are going to list it, or say, no, we don't think it should be listed. And then commonly, there'll be an immediate response and someone will sue them and say, it should not be listed, or it should be listed, pretty much whatever the opposite that the agency did. But that's really a fundamental part of how our government works. We always think of courts as being for criminal matters, but these are civil matters with the sorts of lawsuits that don't necessarily have a trial and a jury. It's often just done with lawyers from both sides submitting policy briefs. Then the court will make the decision. There are also a few laws that contain provisions called citizen suit provisions. So, for example, the Clean Water Act actually allows you as a private individual to sue anyone who's polluting the water, and you can collect damages. There's actually lawyers who make a living. They don't work for the government, but they go out and enforce the Clean Water Act by looking for people who are polluting water and suing them. Then they collect the damages from the polluters. Now, of course, lots of people don't like this because lawsuits are expensive, they're combative, and no one wants to be sued. But on the other hand, what Martin Nye is saying is that this is a fundamental aspect of how our system works. If we don't have these lawsuits, we don't have clear rights, and, of course, the Congress or the legislature can't make every decision. Some laws and regulations are vague or become obsolete because of technological or social changes. And the legal system is there to solve the disputes. And we've read some examples of very important legal decisions that are made that have led to really successful environmental outcomes. The biggest example is the one from Elinor Ostrom, who spoke about how in Southern California groundwater basins, how all the people came to an agreement basically because they were suing each other all the time. And then finally, they reached the settlement in court, and that settlement was legally enforceable. So it held because if anyone violated that settlement, the other people would go to court and sue them. So that's what Martin Nye is talking about in his paper about regulatory enforcement. Environmental laws create rights for citizens that can only be enforced through the courts. I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about regulatory enforcement.